Wilson, thanks for joining Business Weekend. I'd like to start on the issue of financial advice, which of course your committee dealt with this week. The CEO of AMP said that the current framework was essentially like having a sore finger and going to the doctor, and the government being forced to give you a CAT scan for your whole body. I mean, is that a fair characterisation of the sheer cost of the current regime?
Well, I think the concern from the CEO of AMP is that if you make upfront costs, if you make financial advice only available through upfront costs, a number of people then don't seek out financial advice. It becomes very expensive and very costly for a lot of consumers, and it leaves financial advice, frankly, to the rich. And this is one of the concerns that I have, as Mr Ferrari had as well in the hearing the other day, is in a falling economy, and we're in a recession right now, where households are looking at how to save, and they're also making major financial decisions, whether it's about their superannuation, either as part of an industry or retail fund or an SMSF, that they're making informed decisions rather than rash ones which are based on needing to access cash now. And the only way, or one of the key ways that they can make sure they make informed decisions, is to make sure that they're getting financial advice. And of course, when people have limited cash at their disposal, they're not in the position to do so.
Do you think then that perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, maybe some of the recommendations in the Royal Commission and the various other inquiries we've had over the years that have seen changes in the system have maybe gone too far?
Well, I think the objective should surely be to have financial advisors and their incentives in alignment with the best interests of the people they're there to serve, to customers. And so long as you're achieving that, then I think you're broadly heading in the right direction. I think trying to arbitrarily dictate when fees and commission structures can come into place actually misses the point of what is sometimes in the best interests of customers, because sometimes you actually want long-term interests allied. And we had this in the mortgage broking space. The Hayne Royal Commission, I've said this publicly, I think got it wrong in removing trailing commissions. Now the government U-turned on that, because there is an advantage to making sure that mortgage brokers can work in the long-term interest of their clients, particularly for, say, a 30-year or longer investment, compared to just an upfront decision, which means cash in the bank and move on.
Now, just moving on to one of the other issues that your inquiry touched on, and this is the issue of offshore funding of litigation. It's probably a shock to some viewers. It was certainly a shock to me that we're the second most attractive destination in the world now for this sort of activity, with rates of return of more than 15 times the ASX for the various law firms involved. I mean, how is this a problem? I mean, you could say perhaps it's a good thing that Australians are combining together and being able to get access to some sort of compensation.
Well, it's essentially turning courts into vehicles for profit and not justice. The model for litigation funding should be, or the model for class action should be, to get justice for the people who've been wronged. But what courts have done is interpreted essentially that funders don't need to go around and find clients who have a legitimate case. They've interpreted that it's assumed that people who are aggrieved or may be an aggrieved party are an automatic participant in the case, and that's why you're getting such huge sums of money now being considered by courts and actions being taken by courts. And sitting behind that are those who are looking and saying, how do I use courts for profit and not for justice? If they bring up claims and they bring up cases where people are assumed to be participants, even if they've never been spoken to or engaged with, of course, the settlement options are enormous if it's pre-court, and of course, if it goes all the way through to court when their determinations are made, can be absolutely gobsmacking. And of course, all this money isn't carried just by companies. They're ultimately carried by shareholders who lose. So it has an impact in terms of competition in the marketplace, investor certainty, and of course the problems of insurance that many companies face.
Yeah, now the government has made some changes in this area so far. Do you think they've gone far enough to curb these excesses?
Well, in fact, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations has been given an inquiry to look specifically at what we need to do to constrain litigation funding, chaired by James Patterson, and particularly big advocate on that committee for reform in this area, the member for McKellar, Jason Falinski, because some of us have been complaining for some time about not just how courts have interpreted the law that is allowed to create these windfall cases where people walk out sometimes with massive, or the funders with massive rewards for relatively small investments. But also, of course, to assess what is the actual impact and is this the best way to resolve class actions as well. So I think that committee will look at it very seriously, make recommendations for reform to really nip this sort of behaviour in the bud, because it will make it less attractive to invest in Australia. And sure as hell, that's the last thing we read right now.
Just more broadly on the title of your committee, of course, at the moment, at least the inquiry rather, is review of the 4 major banks. So the ostensible purpose, I suppose, is to see how they're going on implementing the Royal Commission recommendations. Are there any areas where you think they're falling short?
Well, it's not just the 4 major banks, it's the major banks and other financial institutions. So we have financial advice, superannuation, insurance, as well as the banks. The reality is a lot of the banks started their implementation but are waiting on legislation that hasn't gone through the Parliament as a consequence of COVID-19. So I think for the most part we're in a holding pattern with the banks in making judgment calls. But really the issue, as much as it's about legislation, is actually about the internal cultural behaviour within banks. That is what came out very strongly in the Hayne Royal Commission. Now, they've already taken steps around reforming their internal incentive structures all the way down to the branch level. We've obviously seen some heads chopped off at the tops of banks, or resignations because of misconduct or a failure to manage it. So I think we're at the end of that phase, but culture doesn't turn around on a dime. It takes time and it takes an attitudinal shift around incentive structures within banks. And I think as we move into a new financial year, we'll continue to see that play out.
Now, some of your critics would say that you've been using the inquiry really as a battering ram, to attack industry super funds. Is there any truth there?
That's complete rubbish. What we've actually been doing is asking difficult questions of everybody. It's just that I think some funds and some entities in the financial services sector politely just aren't used to having scrutiny. We were the first ones to ask Westpac about their AUSTRAC issues. We've been pummelling away at some of the retail funds. We've exposed where industry funds have been doing the wrong thing by rolling over low balance inactive accounts into eligible rollover funds, AusFund, where they've been able to then harvest them for more fees and revenue and insurance products. We're putting the scrutiny on everybody because that's the purpose of the committee. But to be polite, I think what normally happens is committees are given inquiries, they go through the motions, they come up with a body report. We're putting in the hard yards. I spend days just sitting, going through questions, asking difficult ones to make sure we focus on...
Have you finished asking all of the difficult ones? Do you plan on coming back to super, or when is the committee going to wrap up this inquiry?
Well, this inquiry goes for the whole of the life of the Parliament. That isn't my decision. That was the terms of reference given to us by the Treasurer. And the short answer is we're absolutely coming back to super in the second half of this year. We've got dates tentatively scheduled, I think, for August. We may have more in the second half of the year. And we've got, I got a whole bunch of answers back from banks and super funds recently, and I spent all of today writing further questions to explore those answers. Because what frankly often happens in inquiries like this is people wait for the inquiry, they wait for the hearings to come before the committee, a bunch of rudimentary questions are asked, and the funds and financial service institutions can just expand their answers to eat into time, and we don't scrutinise the detail. I've taken a very different approach. Ask questions in advance, scrutinise the answers in the hearings, follow up with further questions, and continue the ball rolling so that they know that we're taking this seriously.
OK, Tim Wilson, that's all we have time for. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam.